Our next presenter is Lee Wallace, who's Associate Professor here in the Department of Gender and Cultural Studies. Chairing takes a particular pleasure as well as pressure when it's your own supervisor, but I'm sure I'll attack it. So Lee's research extends broadly across the narrative entanglements of sexuality and space. Part of my knowing of Lee is through her very beautiful dog, Farley, who I'm glad is here today. So Farley shares a name, as well as the beautiful black curly hair of the heartthrob Farley Granger from two Hitchcock films in 48 and 51. In those films, Granger plays a homosexual main character of the films. And for me, Farley underlines one of the main kind of engagements of Lee's academia and academic career, which is the contours of the closet and homosexuality, as well as its styles and sensibilities. And of course, Farley is beyond those and not limited to them, but nevertheless is part of an important legacy. So I'll turn to Lee now, and her paper today is Reattachment Theory, Gay Marriage as Remarriage.
Thank you
Please
so much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Helen. That was great. You'll see I'm using two prefix operators in my title: reattachment, changing attachment theory, and remarriage, changing marriage. So we're done now, I think. I think this is the application of queer defamiliarisation. Before I start, though, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I've been here for 6 years now, and for a lot of that time I felt really held in this place. And so I thank the elders past, especially past, but present too, for doing that. Okay. Farley would also like to do a shout out to the other prefix operators in the room. Any schnoodles, labradoodles, caboodles, cockadoodles that happen to be in the room, okay? All right. So, and I also thought I'd just give you a snapshot of the paper, because in case you run out of time, you'll also have it. And that's that in this, and this is part of a bigger book that I've been working on that Elspeth's been prompting me to get out in the world for a long time. So thank you too for pushing me to that, Elspeth. So here, so it's my contention is in this bigger project that coincident with the broader evolution of sexual modernity, as we have come to think of it, gay and lesbian experiments in domestic partnership that both resemble and depart from the conventional couple form have, by the end of the 20th century, fundamentally reshaped marriage and our understanding of the principles by which it is defined, namely notions of fidelity, exclusivity, and endurance. So the recent call for marriage equality tends, I think, to obscure this extended history, and instead of acknowledging that same-sex marriage, understood as an informal or customary practice, already exists and has done for decades, promotes the conventional understanding that marriage is something gays and lesbians want to borrow from straight culture. So despite the attention given to the recent successes of the marriage equality movement, gay and lesbian marriage has tended to emerge not as a full-blown ideological apparatus exercising hegemony across all the crisscrossing private and public planes that comprise the social sphere, but as a structure of feeling that is more or less quietly absorbed into common law across time through a variety of mechanisms that are attuned to changes in cultural practice and what is or isn't considered appropriate social conduct. Right, so that's the argument. Read the book when it comes out, if I can get someone to publish it. So, here we go. So, in 1999, something else I always also share with the paper before me. In 1999, a moment whose numerological cast seemed to call for apocalyptic diatribes, Michael Warner published The Trouble with Normal: Sex, Politics, and the Ethics of Queer Life, an energetic critique of various normativizing tendencies within American neoliberalism that included a chapter-length polemic against gay marriage, which Warner correctly foresaw as the future of lesbian and gay mainstream activism. In hindsight, one of the most influential aspects of Warner's argument was its insistence that the extension of the right to marry to same-sex couples is less a political achievement than a measure of the broadening reach of normativity, a benign system of social docility that readily encompasses those sexual constituencies who have traditionally been considered and consider themselves beyond its ken. So whereas Warner makes a strident argument for the ethical value of engaging the perspective of those at the bottom of the scale of respectability, queers, sluts, prostitutes, trannies, club crawlers and other lowlifes. So I thought you might need an image for that, so I went to the interweb and found one. The decades since the publication of his book have seen the global uptake and anticipated success of the marriage equality movement, the general naffness of which was recently captured by the Ring Your Granny campaign that in 2015 contributed to Ireland becoming the first country in the world to adopt same-sex marriage by popular referendum. So, frequently running ahead of legal reform, the mainstream embrace of the idea of gay marriage serves to underscore the outlaw appeal of Warner's argument for the value of queer counterpublics, those informal networks of friends and strangers linked together by relations of care that have no recognition in law, but effectively comprise an alternative public sphere in which sexuality is valued for its social stickiness, beyond the mandated lines of heterosexual kinship and family. Now, since Warner first made that argument, others have agreed that far from spreading social equity, the advent of same-sex marriage would only deepen and displace the inequities at the heart of an institution that remains central to the governing heterosexual social order. In addition, they warned by extending social legitimacy to those gays and lesbians who assimilate the heteronorms of marriage, same-sex marriage would further marginalise and disadvantage those who didn't. But, as Louise Richardson Self has recently noted, these well-rehearsed arguments, assimilationist arguments, about whether to accept or reject same-sex marriage on the grounds of its reification of heteronormative privilege, are most useful in clarifying that, at base, the same-sex marriage debate is concerned with the equal regard of LGBT people rather than marriage per se. Right? It's not interested in marriage. I'm interested in marriage. So, as an objection to discrimination, she argues, the argument for marriage equality should thus be based on the recognition of difference rather than the ascription of sameness. So, starting from that premise, Richardson Self argues for the need to understand marriage not as an institutional form that delivers legal privilege to some and denies it to others, but as a full-scale social imaginary that facilitates structures of identity and belonging in association with certain notions of intimacy and kinship, but not others. So from this perspective, the task of the marriage equality movement might be considered not winning political rights, but reimagining the terrain of marriage as comprised of traditional and non-traditional practices of affiliation and care that are horizontally aligned rather than ranked in a moral hierarchy. So Richardson Self argues for the need to bring into social circulation a new meaning-generating story that challenges marriage's stranglehold on notions of affective kinship. So in place of current ideals of marriage, she proposes an expanded narrative of caring love that acknowledges that all persons at all stages of their life require, desire and or deliver care, and that care is fundamental to our flourishing as intersubjective individuals. So advancing this utopian project of shifting the normative ideal of marriage until it becomes radically inclusive of all relations of caring love leads Richardson Self to take a stance against politically expedient arguments for the strategic adoption of current marriage norms. She points out that those countries that moved early to legalise same-sex marriage, like the Netherlands, by and large have not seen the advent of new norms and collective behaviours that demonstrate the social acceptance of LGBT populations or their families of choice, but continue to report instances of intolerance. So Richardson Self takes the persistence of homophobia in these liberal jurisdictions, like violent protest in opposition to the proposed introduction of same-sex marriage elsewhere, as evidence that marriage reform has little real social effect beyond the endorsement and strengthening of the narrative of traditional marriage and the nuclear family with which it remains cognate in the dominant shared Western social imaginary. So a logical extent of this argument, of Richardson Self's argument, would stress that while gays and lesbians may have won the right to marry, whether or not they have children and whether or not those children are recognised as collectively theirs in any legally binding way, they continue to be annexed to compulsory heterosexuality and what Lee Edelman has taught us to call reproductive futurism, the popularly mandated system of symbolic generationalism through which the US public sphere in particular diffuses and redirects present tense calls for social justice into an anodyne emotional mode. So, Now, although this is anathema to queer concerns, this idea that all our wants should be diffracted into this anodyne moan, effective participation of this kind may be exactly what gays and lesbians want from marriage, rather than the rights or privileges they are said to want from it from the activist perspective. So in Kimberly Richmond's book-length account of her quantitative and qualitative survey of same-sex marrying couples from California and Massachusetts, begins with the revelation that of the near 1,500 couples she surveyed, 70% were already registered domestic partners and 55% had already been through non-legal commitment ceremonies. That is, the majority of lesbians and gays seeking marriage, in that tiny window in the States before Prop 8 came in where they could get it, the majority of lesbian gays seeking marriage, often at great personal cost, already had access to the rights associated with marriage, at least at the state level, and many had already experienced the ceremonial aspect of marriage. So that was the results of the survey, and then she did she did follow-up interviews with 100 couples, and she draws out the diverse reasons why gays and lesbians get legally married, so to identify the complexity of both the meaning of marriage and the legal consciousness of those seeking it. And to do this, she draws on the tripartite model of legal consciousness established by Patricia Ewick and Susan Sibley in their 1970s landmark study of the role of law in everyday attitudes and actions. So Richmond initially confirms that the same-sex couples surveyed and interviewed identify a variety of instrumental, validating and oppositional motivations for seeking legal marriage, often in combination with each other. But in addition to this expected result, however, Richmond discovered that some of the couples voiced none of these orientations, and that further, many of them expressed an unmistakable voice of romance, which did not fit with the tripartite model of legality, but rather expressed motives that were seemingly external to the law and legality. They were neither strategic, nor reverent, nor resistant. They were instead aimed at purely emotional, personal, or romantic drives. So Richmond points out that while it's no surprise that marriage is considered a mechanism for attaining these things, it's not entirely intuitive why legal marriage, as opposed to a wedding ceremony or equivalent ritual, was a necessary component to satisfying these drives. As she goes on to argue, this can only be accounted for by acknowledging the hegemonic power of law and the way that it infuses human relations, even in barely perceptible ways. Sensitive to the many motivations for marriage and orientations to law expressed across and within the couple she interviewed, Richmond emphasises the critical significance of the emotional schema engaged by her interview subjects, many of whom initially sought out marriage on completely different grounds. Not only does Richmond's study reveal that the newly emerging right to marriage for same-sex couples is one that is not confined to the instrumental, political, or even symbolic realm, but it reveals law to be a conduit or cultivator of emotion, insofar as the data shows that the personal or affective import of law is often unsought or unexpected, but nevertheless profoundly felt. Now it seems to me that this evidence, I just love that it started, Raymond, this evidence for the emotional impact of marriage law, even on those who initially bring nothing but political pragmatism to it, is extremely suggestive. It's not that people are dumb or wrong to have a feeling for marriage or to think that they don't have any such feeling, but rather that this phenomenon, whether anticipated or unanticipated, speaks to the affective as an important and motivating reality in people's everyday public lives. Now, Lauren Ballant has identified our collective yet highly individualised attachment to the story of emotional attachment as one of the abiding vectors of contemporary life, in which multiple pedagogies instruct us in the wisdom of identifying having a life with having an intimate life. So Ballant traces the origins of this intimate regime back to a liberal society founded less on separate public and private spheres than on the constant and complex migration of intimacy expectations between the public and the domestic. Right? The migration of intimacy expectations between the public and the domestic. Now, while the drive towards intimacy that we've all been instructed in may take many forms, only some of those forms harden off into social conventions. The longest standing, and I would say the most adaptable of these intimate conventions, is the story of marriage, since, as Ballant points out, it exactly satisfies the enigmatic requirement that the inwardness of the intimate is met by a corresponding publicness. That is, of all the things marriage does, it is the way in which it trains us to experience our internal lives theatrically, as though oriented to an audience, that is key to its social canonicity. Right. Now, so while the first to acknowledge that attachments themselves have no preordained utility and are typically marked by contradictory energies and ambivalence, Berlant argues that the story of marriage generates an aesthetic of attachment that is normatively promoted across private and public domains in a way that stabilizes, clarifies, and cultivates the couple and the life narrative it generates. And she goes on to argue that against this normative narrative, the narrative of the couple, the story of marriage, she contends that alternate intimacy plots, particularly those based in appetites rather than love, community, and patriotism, which is the trifecta of emotions that are uniquely tied up in American notions of marriage. And I hope you're getting a sense of how Americanist most of this discussion of same-sex marriage is. That she said, so up against this normative narrative, those other stories based in appetites, they struggle to find a designated place in culture and must develop an aesthetics of the extreme in order to be publicly heard. So if you don't know, you all know where I got this, don't you? Yes, right. So I was thinking here in relation to Farley that the lives of dogs around Mardi Gras are really, everything, the world is strange, it turns upside down. They're all sitting in their homes at 6 o'clock on Sunday morning, and their owners come in and start having gins in the middle of the morning, or at least they do in our house. So this is the aesthetics of the extreme. So in the book-length project of which this paper is just a part, I go on to think, alongside rather than contra to Berlant, that almost since its 18th century inception, the story of marriage, or the marriage plot, as it's known in histories of the novel, has proven capacious enough to harbour non-normative plot lines alongside the publicity they require to thrive. So this is what I'm interested, partly through the relation between these non-normative plot lines and publicity. So, but for today's purposes, I would simply like to challenge the idea that marriage never has, never will, provide hospitable ground for the advancement of gay, lesbian, or queer life. Right, so I want to just defamiliarise that idea. So Laura Kipnis, to name another in my roster of queer opponents to marriage, was among the first to characterise the married couple as the deadening form through which most people bind themselves to the social. Waged initially as an essay-length polemic and subsequently expanded into a highly successful trade book, Kipnis's project is a kind of thought experiment that considers the widespread practice of adultery as a means to understanding the personal and sexual exhaustion that attaches to the monogamous couple, whether legally married or bound together by common law. So tracing the contours of the adultery melodrama with its equal opportunity cast of cheating wives, philandering husbands, straying domestic partners, suspicious spouses, cuckolds, and bedroom dicks, Kipnis argues that the erotic and affective labour required by the longue durée of coupledom, is alienated in the Marxist sense. It binds partners to an object or idea, their coupled happiness, that is irretrievably lost to them. And against the state of bondage, this coupled bondage, Kipnis poses adulterous disruption as a yearning toward unsanctioned utopias of good feeling, a kind of emotional avant-gardism that carries the force of radical progressiveness. All right, so instead of considering that the evolution of homosexuality and the monogamous couple form might have mutually entangled histories, which is what I argue in my book, that these two forms come together, homosexuality and the couple form have entangled histories, much recent queer critique seems designed to get shot of both marriage and the couple as quickly as possible. For example, while both Warner and Kipnis invoke the queer talent for promiscuous stranger intimacy against the social dominance of the couple within and outside marriage, Michael Cobb has recently targeted the couple from the perspective of the uncoupled. In the process of theorising singleness, Cobb takes apart the notion of the lonely crowd, a mid-20th century sociological concept that continues to hold sway in accounts of the bleakness of the social landscape after the eviscerating effects of technological modernisation. And Cobb points out, very smartly I think, the surprising longevity of the lonely crowd diagnostic, whose second win gets a third win with the advent of each new form of technology that ostensibly brings others closer, but only via a network of estrangement that promotes shallow over deep relationalities, novelty over reflection, distraction over commitment. In this account, the contemporary embrace of social media is merely the most recent example of a technological modernity that diminishes our capacity for meaningful solitude and underscores the fundamental loneliness of a social sphere that can only be alleviated through inward-directed contemplation and the enduring intimacy known as couple love. So while Cobb is concerned with the conceptual rescue of singleness from its association with loneliness, an experience he pins on the social ubiquity of couples, I'm interested in a longer history of this account of the social isolation considered endemic to modern life and its impossible positioning of the couple as its sexual remedy. So for all the imagination that Cobb brings to the project of thinking about singleness uncoupled from the couple, his account of the couple is breathtaking for the social and psychic violence said to be at its core. So drawing first on Hannah Arendt's account of totalitarianism, those of you in totalitarian, right? And second on Leo Bassani and Adam Phillips' psychoanalytic account of generic interpersonal relating, Cobb argues that couple intimacy is a compact through which people destructively over-personalise and territorialise their relations with each other, instead of pursuing forms of impersonal intimacy that are indifferent to personal identity. So in this weighted comparison between the coupled and the uncoupled, the single is a flaneur figure with an impossible thought project, one who stands in a way of existence that is as unconditional as the vista she surveys, who can tolerate herself for much longer, much larger than the couple's chopping block ordinarily permits. Okay. So in the wake of modernity's social insistence that you must never be on your own, that you must always relate as two, the heroic singleton is trying to re-sacralize itself by removing the face of the other. The single, he says, goes to this holy place and doesn't just see the painful, standardizing culture of couple control, right? So he said, and again, finally he says again, that it is the mundane logic of the couple in comparison has become the way one binds oneself to the social, otherwise known as the crowd. And so I'm not very good at PowerPoint, but I've gone all out with this one. And I just, thank you. And no, really, thank you. So this one, I was trying, how the hell am I going to get an image that does the couple logic and puts it to the crowd, and then I found this one. So can I say, just in case, this one's for Anna Marie. All right, it's actually an article on the web about how couples in Mumbai on Marine Parade, which I think of as now Pleasure Beach. It's Pleasure Beach that, the article's about how it explains our natural love of symmetry, but actually it's an article about how couples always place themselves equivalent distances apart from other couples. So it seemed the perfect thing about the couples binding themselves to a logic of the social, so and finding the perfect balance or scene between privacy and the public. All right, so that although Cobb associates the couple with romance and the persistence of an idealized form of erotic love, this linking of the couple with the socially anonymous form of the crowd gets closer to the historical conditions through which the heterosexual couple emerges as a sexual and social problem, and thus a magnet for biopolitical discourses of improvement. However romantically idealised, the couple form is discursively hemmed in through the constant exposure of its incapacities and limitations relative to the newly transparent standards of modernity, which include not only expectations of romance and intimacy, but also new stretch targets of sexual equality as measured by increasingly varied and highly specific metrics. So applying a Foucauldian scheme beyond the usual bandwidth of perversity, Anna Marie Jargos has shown how the well-regulated heterosexual couple is repeatedly required to figure as the solution to the apparent incommensurateness of male and female sexuality through early 20th century marriage manuals that promote simultaneous orgasm as the measure of erotic reciprocity. So you can read Anna Marie, but you don't have to. I've been working with Ari Vroman recently from the social sciences, Ariadne. She wants to give me, she said there's a Hemingway app available that will take all these sentences and turn them into short declarative sentences. And she's suggesting that I get it. So if I got it, of course, I would give it to Anna Marie, because I thought today that if there is a couple's chopping block in our house, it is an editorial chopping block. So there you go. So the point there is, where Cobb points to the idealization of the couple, Anna Marie points to its normatization, a phenomenon that is neither confined to marriage, nor, I would add, limited to the heterosexual. Rather, operating in concert with other modern impulses to equality, the discourse of sexual reciprocity that begins to penetrate marriage at the beginning of the 20th century ultimately bestows on other heterosexual and non-heterosexual practices the status of normalcy. Building across the 20th century, an erotic parallelism is established between heterosexual and homosexual relationships and their alternates that might or might not take marriage-like form. So the point here is, I think there is an extreme relativization of marriage that happens in the 20th century that we are the beneficiaries of, by and large. So the perspective afforded by the historical success of the marriage equality movement can only reinforce the idea that this biopolitical expansion does not end with the homosexual, but will continue to extend across the spectrum of the erotosphere, pulling others, most obviously the transgendered, into its normatizing orbit. So Anna Marie's account of sexual modernity is also useful in its identification of other factors at work across the board. Across the 20th century, she points out, various biomedical epistemologies increasingly index sex, whether premarital, marital, extramarital, or postmarital, and in particular orgasm, which is much harder to conceive of in marital terms, to the normative values of personhood at the same time as they strip personhood from sex. So as a result of this contradictory drive to sexual personalisation and depersonalisation, the double bind of modern sex emerges when no matter how much sex is imagined as a privileged practice for the alleviation of the anonymity that characterised modern social relations by dint of it being apprehended as an intimate act, whereas Hemingway when you need him, both particularising and privatising, it is equally available for the experience, whether depressive or euphoric, of the same impersonal intimacies it is normatively understood to counter. So newly available for scientific codification and increasingly severed from reproduction, sexual satisfaction becomes both a personal and impersonal measure of the achievement of interpersonal intimacy, and remains so in the context of heterosexual relationships that are less tightly twined with the institutions of kinship and family than ever before. Right, so marriage is changing. It's getting sexualized in this thing. So this imbrication of personal and impersonal intimacies in heterosexual relations that are more heavily weighted with interpersonal expectation, including expectations around sexual satisfaction, but increasingly cut free of traditionally mandated social institutions, like the family, also provide the historical context through which the relation between marriage and homosexuality must be rethought. So put another way, it is the normative detachment of heterosexuality from marriage, a relative detachment of heterosexuality from marriage as a compulsory social form, and its complex repositioning as an electively sexual form that permits marriage's attachment to homosexuality, a possibility that is further enhanced by the detachment of marriage from marriage, a contradictory state of affairs affected by the social rise of divorce. So cut off at the knees by the social acceptance of divorce, marriage, as I go on to argue in the chapters that will make up this book, relaunches, another, not just a launch, but a relaunches itself as a different kind of sexual, social and domestic ideal, and builds anew appropriate internal and external structures of support. So in this upside-down world, which has been in place for well over a century, it is entirely conceivable that gay and lesbian experiments in domestic partnership that both resemble and depart from the conventional couple form might have fundamentally reshaped generic understandings of marriage and the principles by which it is defined, namely fidelity, exclusivity, endurance. So I've argued that the relation between, and I do this at much greater length in the book, I don't even mind calling it a book, it's an incomplete manuscript. I argue that the relation between homosexuality and the couple form is historically richer and more complicated than currently acknowledged in either the specialist domain of queer theory or mainstream same-sex marriage debates. So in the chapter that will follow the one from this paper is drawn, I go on to argue that, as counterintuitive as it might seem, it is the rise of divorce that provides the context in which gay and lesbian relationships can appear as leading-edge exemplars of what long-term relationships might look like when separated from the contractual and sacral obligations previously associated with marriage. With the popularisation of divorce, the purpose and ideal of marriage, including the publicity it gives privacy, is both de-idealised and subject to a complicated re-idealisation outside the expectations with which it is conventionally associated. So as numerous others have identified, the marriage crisis of the early 20th century saw the traditional underpinnings of marital life worlds systematically questioned from all points of the social compass. Subject to specialist commentary and analysis, the future of marriage also became the subject of intense popular speculation, not least in the 1930s and 40s Hollywood films that took marriage and divorce as their narrative focus. Now, while feminist social historians have looked at this period, the 30s and 40s, they've looked at this period and they've emphasised the widespread acceptance of divorce in enabling middle-class women to opt out of marriage without social shame. I consider the way in which the popularisation of divorce disturbed the ideological foundations of marriage and the stories that might be told in its vicinity. That is, rather than look outside marriage for causes of its social demise, my focus is primarily on stories of marriage, or more accurately, marriage as story, a generic form of emplotment that, in both popular and theoretical accounts, has heterosexual and homosexual manifestations. So at the core of my argument are a number of gay and lesbian-themed melodramas that approach the sexual and social problem of marriage in increasingly explicit ways. These films propel us towards a reconceptualization of what same-sex marriage represents as a general social achievement, irrespective of its legal standing. And I'm assisted in my project by Stanley Cavell's account, another remarriage there, where I get the term remarriage. I'm assisted in this project by Stanley Cavell's account of the Hollywood remarriage comedies, a cycle of films that arose in the 1930s and early 40s when marriage was, his term, unsanctified by the easy availability of divorce. The popular success of the films that I showed you, he talks in particular about 7 films. I've only shown you 6 there because I was going to talk about the one that's missing, the Philadelphia story, but I don't think I have time. But the popular success of these films, Cavell argues, reflects a complex reattachment to marriage that, in the wake of divorce, must necessarily be approached as remarriage, as a revitalised commitment to a socially de-idealised form. So you see he was a queer defamiliariser before the name. In our historical moment, when the institution of marriage has been further unsanctified by the social acceptance of same-sex marriage, a cycle of gay and lesbian films has emerged that interrogate the terms on which marriage might be reimagined yet again as a viable social and sexual practice, or, as its critics proposed, abandoned outright. So where Cavell argues that post-divorce all marriage is remarriage, I propose that post-marriage equality all marriage is gay marriage, at least for the popular purpose of renegotiating a general attachment to the form. So the number of films that couple homosexuality and marriage is now so substantive that it is possible to trace patterns and arcs within the genre that anticipate or respond to the emergence of gay and lesbian marriage as a recognised structure of feeling prior to its codification in law. As the films I go on to discuss demonstrate, the previously dominant thematic emphasis on the social problem of the non-recognition of same-sex relationships has receded in favour of an emphasis on the problem of discontent generated within same-sex relationships conceived on a continuum with straight marriages. Now, this is not an absolute shift, nor is it strictly chronological. Rather, the overall cycle retains its appeal and flexibility in being able to reanimate the theme of same-sex marriage from different perspectives and to different ends, often within the same text. In this sense, the cycle explores the problem of same-sex marriage that, like the problem of marriage in general, turns on the primary riddle of sexuality and its expression in attachments of more or less durable form. To track this idea further, the last film I turn to is Andrew Haig's 45 Years, a recent film about a straight marriage written and directed by a gay man. Haig's film is an unsolicited endorsement of my argument that the advent or imminence of same-sex marriage has altered the emotional, sexual, social and ethical framework through which we now encounter marriage in general. All marriage is gay marriage. So the historical arc described by the explicitly gay or lesbian-themed melodramas I select for discussion corresponds to the time frame across which marriage has in many jurisdictions been legally redrafted as an institution capable of including gays and lesbians. I argue that these films do not simply reflect the social and legal change with which they are coincident, but rather run ahead of it in compelling and contradictory ways. Instead of promoting an inclusive model of marriage that accommodates heterosexuals and homosexuals alike, these films and the complex narratives they inscribe fundamentally alter our sense of what sexual attachment might involve as a social rather than a romantic form. Rather than regarding these films as affirmative representations of gay and lesbian couples, I argue for the ongoing significance of melodrama as a form that mediates between sexual and social innovation in complex ways. With their capacity to capture the mutability of feelings as they emerge under specific historical conditions, the films I discuss enable us to re-specify our erotic, affective, and ordinary attachments to people through the framework or the perspective of the long term. As I hope I've emphasised against the tide of the queer critique of marriage, I make a strong argument for the ongoing pertinence of the story of marriage and the narrative sensibility it cultivates as generative of the conditions through which we continue to experience ourselves as subjects of feeling and agents of social change. Thank you.